The great crystal towers of Nexus Prime had never seen such panic before. Ambassador Cathara watched the holographic display with growing fear as red markers spread across the galaxy map like a deadly infection. Each red dot meant another star. System had fallen to the Zephyrian horde in each day. Brought more bad news. The Galactic Council chamber buzzed with worried voices from dozens of different species. The Altarians spoke in their musical tones while their crystal bodies flickered with stress patterns. The Vorthak delegation made clicking sounds that their translators turned into urgent warnings. Even the ancient cerebrals had emerged from their meditation chambers to witness what many believed would be the end of galactic civilization. Elder Voss stretched his long tentacles across the council table as he addressed the assembly. His voice carried the weight of 800 years of experience, but today it trembled with uncertainty. The Zephyrian bioships had proven unstoppable against every weapon the galaxy possessed. Their living hulls, adapted to energy weapons and their swarm tactics, overwhelmed even the largest fleet formations. 3 cycles of warfare had taught the galaxy a harsh lesson. Diplomatic solutions meant nothing to creatures that viewed all other life as food. Economic sanctions were useless against beings who consumed entire planets for sustenance. Military might had failed repeatedly as the Horde learned from each battle and evolved new defenses. Cathara rose from her crystalline seat and her form pulsed with desperate urgency. She had lost her homeworld just 2 weeks ago and watched helplessly as the bioships stripped away the atmosphere and devoured every living thing on the surface. The screams of her people still echoed in her mind through their psychic connection until the moment the last crystal went dark. The ambassador activated the central display and showed the council the latest intelligence reports. The Horde had divided into 3 massive fleets, and each one was heading toward a different sector of civilized space. Within 6 months, they would reach the core worlds, including Nexus Prime itself. The mathematical projections were clear and terrifying. Elder Voss spoke again, and his words brought uncomfortable silence to the chamber. There was indeed one species they had not approached for help. The humans of the Sol system had been contacted 50 years ago when they first achieved faster-than-light travel. Most council members had dismissed them as primitive warmongers who barely deserved associate membership status. The human homeworld called Earth was a violent place where different groups had fought countless wars throughout their history. Their technology relied heavily on kinetic weapons and explosive devices that most civilized species considered crude and barbaric. Their society was aggressive, and their diplomatic methods were often described as blunt and unsophisticated, but some council members remembered the intelligence reports from human conflicts. These beings had a talent for warfare that bordered on the disturbing. They seemed to take pleasure in developing new ways to destroy their enemies, and their military history was filled with tactics that other species found shocking in their brutality. The debate that followed was heated and filled with cultural prejudices. The cerebrals argued that humans lacked the mental sophistication to understand galactic warfare. The Altarians worried that human methods would be too destructive and cause unnecessary suffering. The Vorthak claimed that primitive species should not be involved in civilized conflicts. Meanwhile, in the Sol system, Admiral Claire Morrison stood on the bridge of the human defense station orbiting Mars. She had been monitoring galactic communications for months and knew about the Zephyrian advance long before any official contact. Her weathered face showed no surprise when the priority transmission finally arrived from Nexus Prime. Lieutenant Jake Patterson handed her the decoded message with barely contained excitement. The young officer had been itching for action ever since graduating from the Naval Academy, and the prospect of real combat made his pulse quicken. Morrison read the formal request for assistance with growing amusement. The message was carefully worded to avoid any admission that the galaxy needed human help. Instead, it spoke of opportunities for cooperation and mutual benefit. It suggested that humanity might contribute to the galactic defense effort in whatever small way they could manage. The condescending tone was obvious even through the diplomatic language. Morrison had spent 30 years climbing through the ranks of human military command. She had fought in the Martian Independence War and commanded fleets during the Jupiter mining conflicts. She understood violence in ways that most galactic species could never comprehend. And she knew exactly what the galaxy was really asking for. The Admiral turned to Patterson and gave him orders that would change the course of galactic history. She told him to contact Fleet Command and authorize the deployment of the Terran Defense Fleet. Every available warship was to be prepared for immediate departure to the Kepler system, where the Zephyrian Advance Forces were currently operating. As Patterson hurried to carry out his orders, Morrison allowed herself a cold smile. The galaxy had spent 50 years treating humanity like violent children who needed to be controlled and civilized. They had imposed restrictions on human military development and tried to force human society to conform to their peaceful ideals. Now, those same species were desperately calling for help from the barbarians they had looked down upon for so long. They wanted human firepower, but they had no idea what they were really asking for. Morrison knew that once humanity entered this war, there would be no going back to the old ways. She opened a communication channel to Earth and began dictating orders to the military high command. The message was simple and direct in typical human fashion. The galaxy had asked for help, and humanity would provide it, but they would do so according to human rules and human methods. The war was about to begin. The hyperspace jump point at the edge of Kepler 442 system erupted with brilliant flashes of light as the human fleet emerged from faster-than-light travel. Captain Ben Rodriguez stood on the bridge of the UNS Retribution and watched the tactical displays update with information about the battlefield ahead. What he saw made him shake his head in disgust at the galactic military doctrine. The coalition forces were arranged in neat formations with their sleek ships maintaining careful distances from each other. Their vessels looked more like art pieces than weapons of war, with smooth curves and minimal visible armaments. They were conducting what they called precision strikes against the Zephyrian bioships using focused energy beams that barely scratched the enemy armor. Rodriguez had studied the battle reports during the 3-week journey from Earth, and he understood why the galaxy was losing this war. The so-called civilized species fought with restraint and tried to minimize damage to enemy vessels. They aimed for weapon systems and propulsion units, hoping to disable rather than destroy. Their tactics were based on the assumption that all conflicts could eventually be resolved through negotiation. The Zephyrian horde had no such limitations, and their bioships were already adapting to the coalition weapons. The living hulls were developing new armor configurations that dispersed energy attacks, and their organic systems were evolving countermeasures in real time. Each passing hour made them stronger, while the coalition forces grew weaker. Chief Weapons Officer Lisa Chang reported that the human fleet was ready for combat, and all weapon systems were showing green status indicators. The railgun batteries were loaded with tungsten penetrator rounds, and the missile tubes were filled with nuclear warheads. The point defense systems were online, and the electronic warfare suites were preparing to jam enemy communications. Rodriguez opened a communication channel to the coalition command ship and introduced himself to Admiral Jektar of the Centaurian Navy. The alien commander seemed confused by the human ship designs and asked why the vessels carried so many kinetic weapon systems. He explained that most civilized species had moved beyond such primitive armaments centuries ago. The human captain listened to the lecture about proper military conduct with growing impatience. Jektar spoke about minimizing casualties and preserving enemy vessels for study purposes. He outlined engagement rules that prohibited area effect weapons and required targeting specific subsystems rather than attempting total destruction. He seemed genuinely puzzled by the human preference for overwhelming firepower. Rodriguez cut the communication short and turned to his tactical officer, Lieutenant Dan Miller. The young man had been watching the enemy formation through the ship sensors, and his analysis was not encouraging. The Zephyrian bioships were massive organic constructs that dwarfed even the largest coalition vessels. Their adaptive armor was already showing resistance to the energy weapons being used against them, but Miller also noticed something that the galactic forces had missed in their careful approach to warfare. The bioships were clustering together, in tight formations that would be vulnerable to weapons designed for maximum destruction rather than precision targeting. Their organic nature made them susceptible to certain types of damage that energy weapons could not inflict. Rodriguez gave the order that would introduce the galaxy to human military philosophy. All ships were authorized to engage with maximum firepower and complete freedom to choose their own targets. There would be no attempts to disable or capture enemy vessels. The objective was simple and direct: destroy everything that moved. The opening salvo from the human fleet lit up space with the fury of controlled violence. Railgun rounds accelerated to significant fractions of light speed, punched through bow armor like bullets through paper. The kinetic energy transfer was devastating, and entire sections of enemy ships simply vaporized under the impact. Nuclear missiles followed the initial barrage, and their detonations created expanding spheres of superheated plasma that consumed everything within their blast radius. The effect on the Zephyrian formation was immediate and catastrophic. Ships that had withstood hours of energy weapon bombardment were torn apart in seconds by weapons designed with only one purpose in mind. The organic hulls that could adapt to beam weapons had no defense against the simple physics of mass traveling. At enormous velocity. Coalition observers watched in stunned silence as human tactics proved devastatingly effective. Where their careful precision strikes had barely damaged the enemy armor, the human approach was achieving complete destruction of target vessels. The bioships that had seemed invincible were reduced to expanding clouds of debris and vaporized. Organic matter. Rodriguez monitored the battle progress with professional satisfaction. The human fleet was performing exactly as designed, and their doctrine of overwhelming firepower was proving superior to galactic methods. Enemy vessels that tried to adapt to the kinetic bombardment found themselves targeted by different weapon systems before their organic processes could complete the necessary changes. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Davis reported from the Missile Control Center that their nuclear warheads were particularly effective against the bioship power systems. The organic energy distribution networks could not handle the electromagnetic pulse effects, and entire vessels were going dark after single hits. The radiation was also interfering with the adaptive armor processes and preventing rapid healing of damaged sections. Within 2 hours of engagement, the supposedly unstoppable Zephyrian advance force had been completely eliminated. The human fleet had suffered minimal damage and used less than 20% of their available ammunition. Rodriguez surveyed the battlefield with grim efficiency and noted that several enemy vessels had attempted to flee during the final phase of combat. Those ships had been hunted down and destroyed by human pursuit vessels equipped with advanced sensor systems. There would be no survivors to report back to the main Horde fleet, and no opportunity for the enemy to study human weapons and develop countermeasures. The engagement had been thorough and complete. Admiral Shekhtar requested permission to come aboard the Retribution to discuss human tactics and learn from their success. Rodriguez granted the request, but warned the alien commander that he might not like what he discovered about human military methods. The galaxy had asked for help and humanity had provided it, but the cost would be higher than anyone expected. As the human fleet prepared to move deeper into contested space, Rodriguez reflected on the lessons of this first engagement. The galaxy had spent centuries developing sophisticated methods of limited warfare, designed to minimize destruction and preserve the possibility of negotiated settlements. Humanity had spent the same time perfecting the art of total annihilation. The war had begun in earnest, and the Zephyrian Horde was about to learn what happened when they faced opponents who viewed combat as a problem to be solved through the application of overwhelming violence. The galaxy had called for human firepower, and now they would see exactly what that meant. News of the human victory at Kepler 442 spread through the galactic communication networks faster than the speed of light itself. Most species dismissed the reports as exaggerated propaganda or lucky circumstances that would never be repeated. The Zephyrian Horde command structure took a very different view of events and immediately began planning their response to this new threat. General Alex Chun reviewed the intelligence reports from his mobile command post on the surface of Vega. prime where coalition forces were preparing defensive positions. The data was troubling but not surprising to someone who understood military adaptation. The enemy had learned from their defeat and was sending a much larger force equipped with new, biomechanical warriors designed specifically to counter human weapons. These new, Zephyrian ground troops were fascinating examples of rapid organic evolution guided by hostile intelligence. Their carapaces could absorb kinetic impacts and redistribute the energy through specialized organ systems. Their healing factors had been enhanced to repair damage from explosive weapons, and their sensory arrays were tuned to detect incoming projectiles before impact. Colonel Maria Santos stood beside Chun and studied the tactical displays showing enemy troop movements in the outer system. Her expression was calm despite the overwhelming numbers arrayed against their position. She had served with Chun during the Titan Rebellion and understood his approach to seemingly impossible military situations. The enemy was expecting human forces to react with shock and dismay when their previous tactics proved ineffective against the new Bayo warriors. They assumed that humans would adapt slowly like other galactic species and try incremental improvements to existing weapon systems. This fundamental misunderstanding of human military doctrine would prove to be their downfall. Chun opened a communication channel to all human commanders on the planet and began issuing orders that would have horrified the coalition observers if they had understood the implications. The general was not planning to adapt human weapons to counter enemy defenses, but instead intended to change the entire nature of the battlefield itself. Human military doctrine had been shaped by centuries of warfare on a planet where survival depended on the complete destruction of enemy forces. Other species fought limited conflicts with specific objectives and clear rules of engagement. Humans fought total wars where the only acceptable outcome was the absolute annihilation of anything that threatened their existence. The Zephyrian ground assault began with a coordinated landing of biomechanical warriors across multiple sites on the planetary surface. These creatures were designed to be nearly indestructible by conventional galactic standards, and their adaptive capabilities allowed them to evolve countermeasures to any weapon system used against them repeatedly. But the human response was unlike anything in galactic military history. Instead of engaging the enemy forces directly, Chun ordered his artillery batteries to begin systematic bombardment of the entire combat zone. High explosive shells rained down in patterns designed to crater the landscape and eliminate any cover or concealment that enemy forces might use. The organic warriors found themselves in an environment that changed faster than they could adapt to it. Areas that provided protection one moment became killing fields the next as human engineering units used shaped charges to alter the terrain. Rivers were diverted through demolition work and forests were burned away with incendiary weapons that created walls of fire across vast areas. Lieutenant Colonel Bob Turner commanded the artillery units, and his batteries were working around the clock to maintain the devastating barrage. His crews had trained for this type of sustained fire mission, and their equipment was designed for prolonged combat operations. The humans had brought enough ammunition to level mountains, and they intended to use every round. The Zephyrian bio-warriors attempted to adapt to the changing battlefield conditions but found themselves facing new challenges before they could complete previous evolutionary cycles. Their carapaces that deflected kinetic impacts were useless against the concussive effects of carpet bombing. Their enhanced healing factors could not cope with chemical weapons that prevented cellular regeneration. Dr. Helen Wright documented the battle from her position with the 5th Marine Division, and her field reports provided a scientific perspective on human military methods. She observed that the enemy forces were trying to evolve faster than the battlefield environment could change, but human engineering was deliberately accelerating the pace of destruction beyond biological adaptation limits. Fighter bombers screamed overhead, dropping cluster munitions that scattered thousands of small explosive devices across enemy positions. These weapons were designed to deny large areas to infantry forces, and their random detonation patterns made adaptation impossible. Napalm strikes followed the cluster bombs and created fires that burned for days while consuming oxygen needed for organic life. Support systems. The human approach to ground warfare shocked coalition observers who were accustomed to surgical strikes and minimal collateral damage. Where other species fought carefully to preserve infrastructure and civilian populations, the humans seemed determined to turn the entire planet into an uninhabitable wasteland if that was what victory required. Major Kate Williams led a reconnaissance unit deep into enemy territory and reported that the bio-warriors were showing signs of evolutionary breakdown. The constant environmental changes were forcing their organic systems to attempt multiple adaptations simultaneously, and their biological processes were beginning to fail under the stress of rapid mutation cycles. Chun monitored the battle progress from his command center and noted with satisfaction that enemy forces were beginning to withdraw from contested areas. The Zephyrian warriors had been designed to fight conventional opponents who used predictable tactics and limited weapons. They had no response to enemies who treated entire planets as expendable resources in pursuit of military objectives. The final phase of the ground campaign demonstrated the fundamental difference between human and galactic military philosophy. Where other species sought to achieve their objectives with minimum force, humans believed that overwhelming violence applied quickly was more merciful than prolonged conflict. They preferred to end wars decisively rather than allow them to drag on for years. Human flame units advanced through the burning landscape and eliminated the remaining enemy strongholds with weapons designed to cause maximum psychological impact. The bio-warriors discovered that their enhanced healing abilities were useless against temperatures that reduced organic matter to ash within seconds of exposure. As the last Zephyrian forces fled the planet, Chun received congratulations from Coalition Command for his victory. But the alien commanders seemed disturbed by the methods used to achieve success, and their messages contained subtle criticisms of human tactical choices. They spoke of excessive force and questioned whether such destruction had been necessary. Chun dictated his response to the coalition concerns with typical human directness. He explained that the enemy had been completely eliminated with minimal human casualties, and the objective had been achieved in the shortest possible time. The destruction of planetary infrastructure was irrelevant compared to the preservation of human lives and the prevention of enemy adaptation to human weapons. The galaxy was beginning to understand that humans fought wars differently than other species, and the implications of that difference were troubling to civilizations that preferred limited conflicts with negotiated settlements. The Zephyrian horde was learning the same lesson, but from a much more painful perspective, as their supposedly unstoppable forces continued to be destroyed by opponents who refused to follow the established rules of galactic warfare. The Zephyrian horde's response to their repeated defeats was swift and merciless, beyond anything the galaxy had previously witnessed. Instead of adapting their tactics or seeking new approaches to combat, the deadly High Command made a decision that would forever change the nature of the conflict. They deployed their planet-killer bioships against civilian targets in a campaign of systematic extermination. The first world to die was Alteria Prime, where Ambassador Cathara had been born among the crystal forests that had taken millennia to grow. The massive bioship descended through the atmosphere like a living nightmare and began the process of planetary consumption. Within hours, the crystalline structures were dissolving, and the psychic screams of billions of minds being devoured echoed across subspace. 3 more worlds followed in rapid succession as the Horde demonstrated that they would no longer limit themselves to military targets. The bioships stripped away atmospheres and consumed all organic matter down to the bacterial level. Entire civilizations that had existed for thousands of years were reduced to barren rocks floating in space. Coalition forces watched helplessly as their defensive fleets were brushed aside by the massive planet killers. These bioships were the size of small moons and protected by adaptive armor that could withstand even the most powerful energy weapons in the galactic arsenal. Their consumption of planetary mass made them stronger while simultaneously eliminating the resources needed to oppose them, but deep in the Sol System's asteroid belt, construction crews were working around the clock on humanity's response to this escalation. The project had been classified beyond even the highest coalition security clearances and only a handful of human leaders knew. The full scope of what was being built in the industrial complexes hidden among the rocky debris, Admiral Kevin Brooks stood in the command center of the UNS Armageddon and marveled at the achievement of human engineering that surrounded him. The vessel was less a ship than a mobile weapons platform designed for a single purpose. Every system had been optimized to deliver the most destructive force that human science could devise. The dreadnought dwarfed even the largest previous human warships, and its construction had required resources from across the solar system. Entire asteroid mining operations had been converted to provide the exotic materials needed for its primary weapon system. The fusion reactors that powered the ship could have supplied energy to Earth for decades. Lieutenant Commander Nancy Taylor monitored the weapon status displays and reported that all systems were showing optimal performance parameters. The Stellar Lance was a scaled-up version of the railgun technology that had proven so effective against smaller Zephyrian vessels. But this weapon was designed to accelerate projectiles to velocities that approached the fundamental limits of physics. The target was the largest bioship in the Zephyrian fleet, a creature that intelligence reports suggested served as the command node for the entire horde. It was currently in the process of consuming the industrial world of New Geneva and had already stripped away most of the planetary atmosphere. Coalition evacuation ships were fleeing the system as the bioship continued its methodical destruction. Brooks had studied the intelligence data on this particular bioship and understood why the coalition forces had been unable to damage it. The creature was protected by adaptive armor that could redistribute energy across its entire surface area. It had evolved defensive systems that could counter every weapon type in the galactic arsenal, but the human weapon was not in any galactic arsenal and operated on principles that organic armor could not adapt to counter. The Stellar Lance was essentially a particle accelerator the size of a city block that could launch tungsten projectiles at 90% of light speed. The kinetic energy involved was equivalent to multiple nuclear weapons concentrated into a space smaller than a human fist. The firing sequence took nearly an hour to complete as massive capacitor banks charged with energy from the ship's fusion reactors. The magnetic field generators that would accelerate the projectile required careful calibration to prevent the weapon from destroying itself during discharge. Safety protocols demanded that all other ships maintain minimum distances measured in astronomical units. Captain Ryan Foster commanded the escort vessel NZ Vengeance and watched the preparations from what he hoped was a safe distance. His ship's sensors were recording everything for analysis by human weapons development teams, but he suspected that no instrument could adequately measure what was about to happen. The weapon fired with no visible effect, except for a brief distortion in space around the Armageddon's bow section. The tungsten projectile was too small and moving too fast for optical tracking, but the ship's sensors followed its progress across the light minutes of distance to the target. The impact would be visible from 3 star systems away when it finally occurred. The Zephyrian Command bioship had no warning of the incoming projectile, and no time to implement defensive measures even if it had detected the approach. At 90% of light speed, the tungsten rod struck the creature's hull and transferred its kinetic energy in a manner that defied organic comprehension. The bioship simply ceased to exist in any recognizable form. The explosion was visible as a new star in the sky of distant worlds, and the shockwave propagated through subspace to disrupt communications across multiple sectors. Half the Zephyrian fleet was crippled by the destruction of their command node, and the survivors fled in panic as their coordination networks collapsed. Foster watched the expanding cloud of superheated plasma that had once been the largest bioship in the galaxy and felt a mixture of awe and concern. The weapon had performed exactly as designed, but its implications were troubling even to the humans who had built it. They now possessed the ability to destroy any target. Regardless of size or defensive capabilities, the human fleet did not pause to celebrate their victory, but immediately began hunting down the surviving Zephyrian vessels. What followed was not a battle, but a systematic extermination campaign as human ships methodically tracked down every bioship they could locate. The Horde's adaptive capabilities were useless against weapons that simply vaporized their targets completely. Admiral Brooks received status reports from across the combat zone and noted, with satisfaction, that human forces were achieving complete tactical success with minimal losses. The enemy fleet that had terrorized the galaxy for years was being destroyed in a matter of days by opponents who fought without mercy or restraint, but the Admiral also understood that this victory would have consequences beyond the immediate military situation. The galaxy had asked for human help, but they had not anticipated the scale of destruction that human methods would bring to the conflict. The coalition would soon discover that their saviors were more dangerous than the enemies they had been saved from. Dr. Amanda Price observed the battle from the scientific monitoring station aboard the UNS Relentless and documented the performance of human weapons for historical analysis. Her reports would later be studied by military theorists trying to understand how a species could develop such devastating capabilities in such a short time. The answer lay in humanity's violent history and their approach to technological development. Where other species had evolved beyond the need for military innovation, humans had continued to refine their methods of destruction throughout their advancement to interstellar civilization. They had never stopped preparing for the next war. As the last Zephyrian bioships were hunted down and destroyed, the galaxy began to realize that the threat they had faced for 3 years had been eliminated in less than a month by forces they had considered primitive and barbaric. The implications of that realization would reshape galactic politics for generations to come. The war ended not with treaties or negotiations, but with the complete annihilation of the Zephyrian Horde as a military force. Human fleets had systematically hunted down every bioship they could locate and destroyed them with methods that left no possibility of survivors or regrouping. In 80 months, humanity had accomplished what the combined might of galactic civilization had failed to achieve in 3 years of conventional warfare. The victory celebrations on Earth were subdued affairs marked more by relief than triumph. General Patricia Lee stood before the assembled leaders of humanity in the emergency session of the Global Defense Council and delivered her report on the military situation. The Zephyrian threat had been eliminated, but the political consequences of that elimination were only beginning to unfold. Intelligence agencies across human space were monitoring galactic communications, and the intercepted messages painted a troubling picture of growing fear and suspicion. Species that had begged for human assistance were now speaking in hushed tones about the terrifying efficiency of human military operations. Diplomatic channels buzzed with concerns about humanity's disproportionate response to the conflict. Ambassador John Carter had been fielding increasingly hostile questions during sessions of the Galactic Council where representatives demanded explanations for human tactics. They wanted to know why human forces had chosen total destruction over capture and study of enemy vessels. They questioned the necessity of using weapons capable of completely vaporizing targets instead of disabling them for analysis. The criticism focused on humanity's refusal to follow established protocols for military engagement that required minimizing casualties and preserving enemy assets for intelligence purposes. Coalition commanders complained that human methods had eliminated valuable opportunities to understand Zephyrian technology and biology. They seemed unable to comprehend that humans had no interest in studying creatures that posed existential threats. Dr. Rachel Kim from the Institute for Galactic Studies had predicted this reaction during the early planning stages of human military involvement. She understood that the galaxy's peaceful species would be disturbed by the brutal efficiency of human warfare and would eventually conclude that humanity itself represented a new threat to galactic stability. The intercepted communications revealed growing calls for restrictions on human military capabilities and demands for monitoring stations in human territory. Several major species were proposing limits on human fleet sizes and weapons development programs. There was even discussion of economic sanctions designed to force human compliance with galactic military regulations. President Angela Davis convened emergency meetings with military leaders and civilian advisors to discuss humanity's response to these diplomatic pressures. The choice was clear and stark between accepting galactic oversight of human affairs or maintaining independence at the cost of increased isolation from the galactic community. General Lee presented the military perspective with characteristic directness. Human forces had saved galactic civilization from complete extinction and were now being criticized for their methods by the same species they had rescued. The suggestion that humanity should submit to monitoring and restrictions was not only insulting but strategically dangerous. The general pointed out that human military superiority was based on technological approaches that other species considered primitive and barbaric. If galactic observers gained access to human weapons development programs, they might develop countermeasures that would eliminate humanity's defensive advantages. Sharing military secrets with potential enemies was contrary to every principle of strategic planning. Ambassador Carter reported that coalition leaders were becoming increasingly vocal about their concerns regarding human military doctrine. They spoke of humanity as a destabilizing influence that threatened the established order of galactic politics. Some species were even suggesting that humans were potentially more dangerous than the Zephyrians had ever been. The irony was not lost on human leadership that species incapable of defending themselves were now attempting to dictate military policy to their saviors. The same civilizations that had proven helpless against biomechanical swarms were demanding that humans conform to failed strategies that had nearly resulted in galactic extinction. Dr. Kim explained the psychological factors driving galactic reactions to human success. Most species had evolved beyond their violent phases millennia ago, and genuinely believed that warfare should be conducted according to civilized rules that minimized destruction. They were incapable of understanding that some threats required total annihilation rather than limited response. The human approach to conflict resolution was fundamentally incompatible with galactic norms and expectations. Where other species sought to preserve the possibility of negotiated settlements, humans prepared for scenarios where negotiations would be impossible. They built weapons designed to eliminate enemies completely rather than merely defeat them temporarily. President Davis listened to all perspectives before making the decision that would define humanity's relationship with the galaxy for generations to come. She understood that accepting galactic restrictions would inevitably lead to human weakness and vulnerability to future threats. The price of peaceful coexistence would be the abandonment of the military capabilities that had saved galactic civilization. The announcement was broadcast simultaneously to Earth and every coalition world with access to galactic communication networks. President Davis spoke directly to both human and alien audiences with words that would be remembered as humanity's declaration of independence from galactic authority. She acknowledged the concerns of coalition species regarding human military methods but rejected any suggestion that humanity would accept external oversight or restrictions. Human forces had answered the galaxy's call for help and would continue to provide protection to species that requested assistance. But they would do so according to human principles and using human methods regardless of galactic approval. The president made it clear that humanity had not sought galactic integration for the purpose of submission to alien authority. Human civilization had developed its own approaches to survival and security that had proven effective when galactic methods had failed. There would be no compromise on matters of human military doctrine or defensive capabilities. The reaction from coalition leadership was swift and predictable. Several major species announced their intention to restrict human access to galactic trade networks and technological exchanges. Others spoke of forming defensive alliances designed to contain human expansion and influence. General Lee monitored these developments with professional interest and began updating human strategic plans to account for potential galactic hostility. If the species humanity had saved chose to become enemies, then human forces would be prepared for that eventuality as well. The lessons of the Zephyrian War had demonstrated that overwhelming firepower was an effective solution to most military problems. As diplomatic relations deteriorated and galactic civilizations split into factions supporting or opposing human independence, it became clear that the price of victory against the Zephyrians would be measured in decades of political isolation and potential conflict. Humanity had saved the galaxy, but in doing so had revealed capabilities that made peaceful coexistence impossible according to galactic standards. The species that had begged for human help were now afraid of their protectors, and that fear would reshape the political landscape of known space. The galaxy had asked for help and humanity had replied with firepower, but the consequences of that reply would echo through the stars for generations to come. 5 years after the final destruction of the Zephyrian horde, the galaxy had settled into an uneasy equilibrium that bore little resemblance to the peaceful cooperation that had existed before the war. The political landscape had been permanently altered by humanity's demonstration of military superiority and the fear that demonstration had generated among species that valued stability above all other considerations. Humanity had responded to galactic hostility by establishing the Terran Defense Pact, a military alliance that offered protection to any species willing to accept human terms and conditions. The agreement was simple and direct in typical human fashion, with no complex diplomatic language or ambiguous clauses that might be misinterpreted during crisis situations. Member species agreed to allow unrestricted movement of human military vessels through their territory and promised not to interfere with human weapons development or fleet construction programs. In exchange, they received absolute guarantees of protection against any external threat, regardless of the political or military costs involved in providing that protection. Dozens of smaller species had signed the pact despite objections from the traditional Galactic Council leadership. They had witnessed what happened to civilizations that relied solely on diplomatic solutions when faced with existential threats, and chose the certainty of human military might over the false security of galactic bureaucracy. Admiral Steve Morrison commanded the newest addition to humanity's expanding fleet from the bridge of the UNS Deterrent, a mobile fortress that served multiple functions as embassy, monitoring station, and military base. The vessel was a visible symbol of human power that could deploy anywhere in galactic space within days of receiving orders. The ship regularly visited member worlds of the Defense Pact and conducted training exercises with local defense forces. These operations served dual purposes of maintaining military readiness and demonstrating human capabilities to potential enemies who might consider testing the alliance's resolve. Commander Janet Phillips handled diplomatic functions aboard the Deterrent, and her conversations with alien representatives followed predictable patterns. Fear was mixed with grudging respect in nearly every interaction she conducted, and the underlying tension never disappeared despite years of peaceful contact. Ambassador Vrextai of the Centaurian Republic visited the human vessel during its patrol of the Outer Rim territories and raised concerns that had become common themes in galactic politics. He spoke of humanity's tendency to solve problems through overwhelming application of military force and questioned whether such methods were appropriate for civilized species. Phillips listened to the familiar complaints with professional patience before responding with explanations that had become standard talking points for human diplomatic personnel. She pointed out that human methods had proven effective when galactic approaches had failed completely, and that species requesting human protection should expect human solutions to their problems. The conversation turned to hypothetical scenarios that revealed the fundamental differences between human and galactic military philosophy. Vrextai asked what would happen if another species chose to view humanity as a threat similar to the Zephyrian horde and took aggressive action based on that assessment. Phillips answered without hesitation that any species choosing to treat humanity as an enemy would discover the same fate that had befallen the biomechanical swarms. Human defensive doctrine was based on the principle that threats should be eliminated completely rather than merely discouraged or contained through limited responses. The alien ambassador seemed shocked by the directness of this statement and asked whether humans would really commit genocide against entire civilizations over political disagreements. Phillips corrected his terminology by explaining that humans did not consider the complete elimination of hostile forces to be genocide, but rather effective military strategy. The distinction was important to understanding human psychology and approach to conflict resolution. Where other species viewed warfare as an unfortunate interruption of normal diplomatic relations, humans regarded combat as a natural extension of politics conducted through different means. They prepared for war continuously and fought without restraint when violence became necessary. Dr. Lisa Chun served as the deterrence chief science officer, and her research focused on the long-term implications of human military dominance for galactic civilization. Her study suggested that the current political situation was unstable and would eventually result in either complete human hegemony or open warfare between competing factions. The species that opposed human influence were gradually forming their own military alliances and attempting to develop weapons capable of countering human advantages. Their efforts were hampered by cultural factors that prevented them from adopting the ruthless efficiency that characterized human military development. Meanwhile, the human fleet continued to expand and incorporate new technologies that maintained their overwhelming superiority over potential enemies. Construction facilities throughout the Sol system were producing warships at rates that dwarfed the combined shipbuilding capacity of all other galactic civilizations. Captain Mike Foster commanded a squadron of patrol vessels that monitored the borders between human and non-human space, and his reports indicated increasing military activity among species that refused to join the Defense Pact. Intelligence suggested that some coalition worlds were attempting to recreate human weapons technology through reverse engineering of battlefield debris. These efforts were doomed to failure because they focused on hardware solutions while ignoring the doctrinal and cultural factors that made human weapons effective. Building railguns and nuclear missiles was relatively simple compared to developing the willingness to use them without hesitation or restraint against any target that posed a threat. Human military superiority was not based solely on technological advantages but on psychological factors that other species found disturbing. Humans could commit to total destruction of enemy forces because they viewed warfare as a zero-sum competition where compromise meant eventual defeat and possible extinction. The galaxy had learned this lesson during the Zephyrian War, but many species continued to hope that human behavior could be modified through diplomatic pressure and economic incentives. They failed to understand that human military doctrine was based on thousands of years of evolutionary pressure that had shaped their approach to survival in hostile environments. Admiral Morrison received regular intelligence briefings on galactic political developments and noted with interest that several major species were openly discussing the possibility of preemptive action against human expansion. Their military planning was based on the assumption that human aggression was inevitable and could only be prevented through early intervention. This analysis was both correct and dangerously flawed in its understanding of human strategic thinking. Human expansion was indeed inevitable, because their defensive doctrine required the ability to project force anywhere in galactic space where threats might emerge. But human aggression was conditional on the actions of potential enemies rather than predetermined by expansionist ideology. The species planning military action against humanity were creating the very scenario they claimed to fear by treating humans as inevitable enemies. Their hostile preparations were being monitored by human intelligence services and would trigger defensive responses that could escalate into the galactic war they sought to prevent. Commander Phillips often reflected on the irony of the current situation during her diplomatic duties aboard the Deterrent. The galaxy had asked for human help against an existential threat and received exactly what they had requested. Human firepower had saved galactic civilization, but the price of that salvation was the end of the peaceful order that had existed before the war. The new galactic order was based on the simple recognition that military power determined political relationships and that species capable of projecting overwhelming force would dominate those that could not match their capabilities. It was not the civilization that galactic leaders had wanted, but it was the reality that human intervention had created. Humanity had answered the galaxy's call for help and delivered the firepower needed to eliminate the Zephyrian threat. The peace that followed was not built on understanding or cooperation, but on the acknowledgement that humans possessed both the will and capability to destroy any force that challenged their position. In the end, it was enough to maintain stability, even if it was not the kind of peace that anyone had originally envisioned.